The Vostroyan Firstborn are known for their overly ornate uniforms like we discussed in our last video. But there is another regiment of Imperial Guardsmen that stands out for staunch uniforms with a parade ground flair that belies their otherwise overly disciplined nature. The Mordian Iron Guard hail from the planet of Mordian, and have an aesthetic that looks like they came straight from the game Street Fighter, with every single one of them looking like a blue version of M. Bison. Now, with that joke out of the way, we can focus on a regiment of guardsmen that lives on a pretty insane planet and has some tactics that harken back to the American Civil War style of fighting. Some of the elements of the Mordian Iron Guard will borrow from other portions of the Warhammer 40,000 lore as well, with part of their planet being bathed in perpetual night, similar to Nostromo of the Night Lord's fame. All of that being said, the Mordian Iron Guard have a sterling track record that has seemed, or has at least seen them engaged across the galaxy, fighting directly in the enemy's face in the name of the Emperor. So join me once again as we discuss another regiment of Imperial Guardsmen, the Mordian Iron Guard. To begin our tale, we need to really flesh out the absolute nightmare of a planet that is Mordian. For one, the planet's name is an adjective which throws me for a hard loop, as I want to say that they hail from the planet of Mordia. Second, it is one of the few planets in the Imperium with a dual classification. It is both a death world and a hive world. The usual distinction of a death world leaves little room for hive cities, as the planet itself tends to be far too hostile to maintain one city, let alone many a city. Located just to the galactic east of Vostroya, the Mordian system is a well-founded system with industrial, shrine, feral, agri, fortress, and forge worlds within the 8-planet system. What makes Mordian so different from the rest of the planets we've talked about is that it is tidal locked with its star. This means that one half of the planet is constantly facing the system's sun, just like our own moon is tidal locked with Earth. The result is very polarizing, to say the least. The side that faces the sun is a scorched wasteland, constantly bathing in the star's radiation where no one lives. The other side is wreathed in perpetual night, earning the planet the nickname the World of Eternal Night. On top of that, the relative still air, due to the lack of the Coriolis effect, results in a dark atmosphere with very little change at all. To some, this is an absolute nightmare, and in the Warhammer world, it's equally as much of a nightmare, with extremely high suicide rates as well as crime per capita. Overcrowded hive cities with very little in the way of natural resources give way to an unruly populace that fights over the meager scraps that are afforded to them by the luxury of happenstance. This would seem a very unlikely planet to act as a home world for an elite regiment of Imperial Guardsmen, but it's actually the perfect environment to drill highly disciplined fighters. Acting as both a police force and an intergalactic fighting force, the Mordian Iron Guard are the thin line between complete order and total anarchy amongst the population of the planet. Simple conflicts over base human needs break out across the planet on a daily basis, and the Mordian Iron Guard appear in their disciplined, finely wrought uniforms to instill a sense of stability in the populace. You'd think the population of the planet is some lawless group of hive gangs without any form of government or leadership, but you have to remember, this is the Imperium. Lawlessness is really the norm for any hive world, albeit most hive worlds have a good percentage of their planet occupied with hive cities. Mordian has to do the same with half the space. The citizens are ruled over by a governing body called the Tetrarchy, not to be confused with the Vostroyans' Tech-Triarchy. Truth be told, it does less overt governing and more logistics, as the Tetrarchy is responsible for directing the limited rations of the planet across to the hive cities and controlling the few resources that Mordian has for off-world tithing. Part of that tithe are, of course, the Mordian Iron Guard regiments. But the renown of the Iron Guard was relatively unknown before one key battle, or maybe campaign, took place that cemented the staunch, implacable discipline of the elite regiment across the Imperium, the Battle of Mordian. And like I said, in truth, it's more of a campaign that Chaos slowly enacted across Mordian. Much in the same way that it always does, it began with cultists first. The lore recounts this as a particularly hot summer, where all the cultists were having their hot girl summer, drinking White Claws in the perpetual shade of Mordian's night sky. The first movements against the Imperium were started by a clandestine group that wanted to overthrow the Tetrarchy and place themselves as rulers of the planet. Making pacts with the Dark Gods, they began a vicious and heretical spell that would summon the many servants of chaos to the world of eternal night. Throughout the hive cities of Mordian, strange reports came in of cannibal mobs rising in number. Remember, with heavily rationed food and resources, cannibalism was an all too common and kind of accepted occurrence on the planet, as the scavengers looked for more and more people to dine on. Criminal gang activity skyrocketed as the portent of bad things to come often starts in the underworld and works its way up. People were disappearing. There were reports of ghoulish creatures stalking the alleyways and secluded portions of the Underhive. People would come back from Taco Bell after having spent in excess of $40 for 2 individuals. The entire world was acting irrationally. This was chiefly observed in the capital city of Vanandra, where the group of men weaved their deep and forbidden spell to the ruinous powers. As a heat wave struck the planet, the temperatures soared, and on the hottest day, the spell was finally complete and the atmosphere erupted in a massive chaos incursion from all 4 of the mighty chaos gods. Demons, chaos space marines, and other monstrous creatures clawed their way out from the seething maw of chaos rifts all over Mordian. Demons and cavorting devils howled through the tallest city spires and deepest bowels of the Underhive. The Tetrarchs reacted by sending out a distress call from their astropathic choirs to the greater Imperial, which was slapped down like a professional NBA player by the spell of the ruinous powers, gobbling up the message and melting the minds of all the astropaths on the planet. Mordian was alone, their sky filled with terrors and their backs against the wall. Taking a step back here, this is something that's actually frightfully common across the galaxy. Many Imperial worlds fall to the machinations of chaos, completely taking the planet over before a relief force of Adeptus Astartes or inquisitorial elements can be dispatched to reclaim the planet for the Emperor. Even then, that typically isn't really discovered until an Imperial tithe is missed a few times or some other series of miscommunication. For as connected as the galaxy seems, it's frightfully disconnected due to all the many systems and bureaucracy that run and fuel the Imperium. Most, if not all, planets fall before the rampaging hordes of chaos, but not all planets are Mordian, and none of those planets are the homeworld to the Mordian Iron Guard. Rapidly deployed throughout the capital city, the Iron Guard created a defensive circle around the Tetrarchal Palace, fighting the forces of the ruinous powers. Gathering in strength, the Guard Regiment seemed like an ornamental force to the compiled Chaos Marines and Demons. As the interlopers surged to attack and push through the Iron Guard, the regiment earned their namesake, with a horrendous amount of firepower shooting out from the stern lines of the Blue Defenders. Unlike other regiments who fight using the benefit of cover or fortifications, the Iron Guard stand in a regimental fighting style, similar to what you get with the American Civil War. Long lines of soldiers arrayed against the enemy, right where the fighting is thickest and without any cover save their faith in the Emperor. Now, I have to assume that the regiments would take prone, kneeling, crouched, and then staggered standing shooting positions to maximize the volume of fire. In this way, you'd have a total of 4 or 5 lines of infantry unleashing the righteous fury of the Emperor upon the enemy. Greater demons of Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch poured through the chaos rents across the many avenues and streets of Vanandra, the Mordian Iron Guard being pushed back a building at a time, each step back being paid for in the heaping blood of traitors and Neverborn alike. Chaos Space Marine attacks were repelled by fire traps and intricate enfilades created between 2 battle lines of Iron Guard working in unison. You see, these guys know nothing but the stern discipline and courage of fighting for the Emperor, so the movements back are more planned executions of tactics being relayed from the Tetrarchal Palace, rather than the retreats being retreats due to overrun emplacements. After all, I mean, there's no cover for the Mordian Iron Guard. The grand conflict came to its zenith outside of the walls of the aforementioned palace. The Iron Guard, having pushed themselves all the way to the walkway to the doors of the Capitol building itself, formed an impervious wall of lasgun shots. Mortar shells and Lehman Russ battle tanks fired ceaselessly, each guardsman lost to the disciplined rotation of their specific station. The only thing capable of drowning out the howling shrieks of the damned was to practice an unyielding salvos of gunfire pounding into the lines of the forces of chaos. Volley after volley was unleashed as the ruinous powers made their way slowly up the walkway, each step costing them lives innumerable. In the last minute of the last bits of gunfire, as the Iron Guardsmen went from firing drill to close combat, the servants of chaos suddenly vanished, the spell having seemed undone by the Navy in orbit. While the fight on the surface had been one of physicality and bloodshed, the fight in orbit was one of mental psychic warfare against the Dark Gods. The reaping tally from the Iron Guard had weakened the Chaos forces enough for the Imperial Psychers to get an upper hand and banish the fell invaders from their planet. This marks one of the only times in Imperial history that a planet was able to repel Chaos entirely on their own, without the aid of other Imperial Navy, Army, or Adeptus Astartes elements from outside of the system. Since then, the Mordian Iron Guard have been deployed all around the Imperium to locations that need some of the staunchest defenders, unwilling to give a single step to the enemy in pursuit of the Emperor's glory. Now, having gone in on the grand legacy of the Mordian Iron Guard, I think we need to drill down a bit on how their belief system works. What makes them so different from the other Imperial Guard regiments. And it's worth noting here that a lot of these standout regiments that we have or will discuss are going to have a lot of overlapping features. I mean, it's important to remember that there are millions of planets in the Imperium. Hell, it covers 2/3 of the Milky Way galaxy, and a good percentage produce their own Imperial Guard regiments. So while it might seem like one is a copy of another with some minor differences, it's more that these regiments stand out in a sea of mediocre or just outright terrible regiments. But back on track. The Iron Guard are known above all for their, again, staunch, I've probably used this word 50 times already, adherence to orders, a discipline that is extremely uncommon for the overly brazen way in which they exact war on the enemies of the Imperium. Rigidly obedient and overly routined, the Mordian Iron Guard spend a great deal of time ensuring that their uniforms are proper, their medals are shined, their weapons are clean to military standards, and they are ready for war at a moment's notice. This obedience extends to each individual within the regiment, from the foot soldier up to the generals of these famed armies. And we've discussed how sometimes commissars don't quite fit into a lot of these outstanding regiments, and you'd think that a regiment solely focused on duty, discipline, and diligence to the Emperor's cause would be a welcome sight for commissars. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Mordian Iron Guard is typically a lackluster deployment for a commissar, and oftentimes, actually, the Mordians will penalize and punish a commissar for, slacking in their duties. And this is something we've come to expect from a lot of regiments thus far. But a position, such as the commissar, that is relatively feared across the Astra Militarum is actually instilled with a bit of fear visiting the Mordians. Cowardice and lack of discipline are rewarded with the Emperor's justice. Hint, you get shot in the back of the fucking head. This might be why every single soldier within the guard has a similar style hat to the commissar. I mean, what's one commissar amidst a sea of commissars? That's not really the case, but I just wanted to point out the similarity here. And we touched on this briefly in our discussion of the Battle of Mordian, but the Mordian Iron Guard, to reinforce a point, march brazenly into battle, their gigantic ball sacks acting as the only cover that they need. It helps that their uniform is overly protective as well, which we'll cover in the section ahead about their loadouts. But the Mordians line up and unleash disciplined volley after volley, never giving ground or stepping back unless it's to fall back to a preconceived point for overlapping gunfire or some sort of trap, anything else that they can use to kind of get the upper hand. But in addition to their impressive ranks of foot soldiers, the Mordians also employ a high number of armor companies, bringing a huge amount of bane blades to bear upon the enemy. The real strategy of the Mordians is using that fearless dedication to the Emperor to stand in the face of the enemy, unleashing lasgun rounds, while the armored and artillery companies of the regiment create a sort of shield of bombardment. Bane blades, Leman Russ, battle tanks, basilisks, mortars, all of them unleashing unending payloads upon the enemy. And this has undoubtedly led to a high number of casualties amongst the Iron Guard, with their approach putting them directly in harm's way, very similar to the Death Corps of Krieg. But with the creation of each regiment of Iron Guard, they swear an oath to never let their banner touch the ground or fall into the hands of the enemy. It's this intense dedication to their duty that keeps them fighting throughout the many battlefields of the Imperium. And I could see a planet defended by both the Death Corps and the Mordians as one that would be nigh impossible to take. But how does an army that fights in the thick of the battle so much keep itself from getting outright destroyed in the opening portions of any engagement? This is done by some clever tailoring when it comes to their actual battle gear. The ornate and heavily ornamental appearance of their uniform actually hides how durable the stark blue coats actually are. Reinforced with both carapace and flak armor, the Mordian Iron Guard are adorned with some of the best armor that an Imperial Guardsman can get access to. I think like the Praetorian Guard have a slightly step above their shinier armor. But this allows them to stand shoulder to shoulder with other members of the Iron Guard for their continued salvos into the enemy without taking as much damage as your standard rank and file soldier. The rest of their uniform is relatively normal, but the addition to the carapace breastplate helps to increase their resilience substantially. Interestingly enough, this is a bit of lore, I guess, that has sort of gone to the wayside of the more latter editions, and it's certainly not reflected in their armor saves at all. It's one of those lore tidbits that helped to explain why these guys were marching to battle in essentially dress attire, but has just come to be normal as the lore has progressed and gotten weirder. But the more veteran members of the Iron Guard wear a darker shade of blue, with the elite Tempestus Scions of the Guard wearing black or deep navy. And this is evident all the way up to the command structure wearing the same darker blue motifs to help make them stand out to the rest of the rather uniformed regiment. Medals are worn overtly on the breastplate of each guardsman, with their officers having ornate golden tassels or cords running the length of their uniforms for specific commendations or outstanding campaigns. And as we've done for some of our other regiments, we're going to talk a little bit about how they were kind of influenced, or what kind of real-world counterpart you can draw from this. And you can see a lot of Prussian and US military influence throughout the standard uniform of the Mordian Iron Guard. The early 1800s Prussian military seems to be the main source for the style of the thick double-breasted coats and starched-looking pants tucked into high black boots that we get with the Mordians. As was customary of many militaries at the time, the Prussians wore shakos on their heads, something that the Iron Guard clearly do not do. That's more of a Vostroyan thing. But the peaked hats, or the commissar hats that we made fun of earlier, gives you the nod from the US military style of uniform. The typical dress blues, whites, or reds of the various branches all have their respective white peaked hats. Even the uniform of the Mordian Iron Guard bears resemblance to the military uniforms of the Union and later US forces of the latter portion of the 1800s. Similar to the Prussians, you have the thick blue coats with blue pants. And I think that since the uniform of the Iron Guard is rather plain, it's harder to derive a lot of individuality from the regiment. That could be argued to be intentional. What use is their individuality when everyone has a disciplined role to play for the survival of the Empire? It's much in the same way that what you get with the Death Corps of Krieg. Everyone's pretty uniform because it's not your uniform that matters, it's how well you can die for the Emperor. Speaking of survival though, how has this regiment fared in the current era of the Noctis Aeterna and the Cicatrix Maledictum? Well, things have been rough across the entire Imperium. With the birth of the Cicatrix, Mordian finds itself on the Imperium Nihilist side of the Empire, cut off from the guiding light of the Astronomicon as well as the assistance of a calmer Imperium. The Mordian system falls within the Stygius sector of the Segmentum Obscurus, and thus begins the Grand Stygius campaign. Tzeentch had set his eye upon creating his own domain, I guess you could say, seeing that Khorne and Nurgle were doing the same across the Imperium. Spurred on by Magnus's desire to reclaim his home of Prospero, which conveniently fell within the Stygius sector, it was an all-too-fitting occurrence, and the Master of Fates invaded the sector in full force. Cultists caused uprisings across all the planets in the sectors, pushing against the military forces and occupying them before the real invasion could begin. Demons and Chaos Space Marines wreaked havoc across the weakened sector, their infrastructure crippled from the acts of sedition, rebellion, and treachery created by both the cultists and the preferred demon agent, the Changeling. The Stygius campaign was an act to relieve all the many subsectors that were now firmly under the control of Tzeentch's agents in both Magnus and the greater demon in Kachin. The Mordian Iron Guard were deployed to assist against this grand invasion from one of the four Chaos Gods, while also having to defend their own planet. Ultimately, the Stygius campaign was a horrendous war of attrition, Grinding against the unending hordes of ruinous powers, Mordian Iron Guards were deployed to every battlefront to stymie the rampaging forces. A relief force of Adeptus Astartes and other Imperial elements arrived to help reinforce the Mordians across the sector. The Mordians' ability to never give ground was met with the voracious tenacity of the demons of Tzeentch, the Imperial dead, rising as zombies to attack their former brethren. As all seemed lost and the forces of chaos closed in on the last few subsectors of Stygius, an Eldar host from the craft world of Ulthwé arrived to assist the Imperial forces. Typically, when the Eldar arrive, they're very cryptic, speaking in riddles about their overall motive, but that wasn't the case this time. They were pretty straightforward in saying that the sector was lost, and that they were not here to win the day, but rather to help the retreat, or at least cover the retreat of the Imperial forces. Bitterly, the Mordian Iron Guard were pulled out across the sector, and the Stygius sector fell to the forces of chaos. This would mark one of the only times in their history, again, the Mordian Iron Guard voluntarily retreated from an engagement, only to see their planet and sector lost, the very enemies that they had striven to defend against for millennia. In conclusion, the road ahead for the Mordian Iron Guard is a pretty difficult one. Their battle doctrine is supported by a constant flow of new regiments from their home planet of Mordian. Almost every citizen of Mordian has served in the military at one point or another. With their planet lost and their forces depleted, we might be seeing the end to the Iron Guard. They are loosely mentioned in the 8th edition codex with a small little bracket of text, but their models are incredibly out of date. But there is hope though, as they still have a regimental doctrine within the codex, something that the Death Corps of Krieg doesn't even have. Only time will tell how this heavily ornamental yet disciplined regiment will make its way into the growing narrative of the 8th edition lore. One thing is for certain though, that you will always be able to find the Mordian Iron Guard deep in the thick of the fight, the flashes of their gun line barking fury in the Emperor's name, as these grim and resolute soldiers of the Imperium look to defend her glory on every avenue of the Empire. Thanks so much for joining me here today, guys. Was really excited to do this video, as I think a lot of you really wanted to hear about the Mordian Iron Guard. Our next regiment will probably cover the Steel Legion of Armageddon, with their similar attire to the Death Corps of Krieg, but with a rich history of constant conflict with the Orcs. But before I close this video out, I want to point you to a link in my description below. You can now order games from Fanatical through that link, and I think I'll get a percentage of it. I'm not entirely sure of how it works. I just signed up. But if you're looking to pick up any games in the future and want to support the channel, feel free to use that link. I think there's a discount that are factored into it as well. I'm, again, not sure. Either way, guys, thanks so much for watching here today. We have a lot of fun 40K content coming ahead with a Primarch video for Conrad Kurz just around the corner. But as always, have a good one and take care.